Robert E. Lee rarely spoke of Gettysburg in his later years. The war had ended, and with it, the cause for which he had fought. Defeat had been bitter, but he carried it with the quiet dignity of a man who bore responsibility for thousands of lives. He never wrote a memoir, never sought to defend himself in print, never spent his final days justifying what had been done. But imagine for a moment if he had. Perhaps, in the twilight of his life, seated on the porch of his Lexington home, he might have spoken to a trusted family member, one who would not judge, one who would listen without seeking to argue or absolve. If he had unburdened himself of the memories of those 3 days in Pennsylvania, of the choices made, the moments lost, the weight of command, perhaps it would have gone something like this. I awakened before dawn, as had been my habit since my days at West Point. The canvas of my tent fluttered in the June breeze, and I could hear the soft nickering of Traveler from where he was picketed nearby. My old bones protested as I rose from my camp bed. At 56, the rigors of campaign life were increasingly difficult to bear, though I would never admit as much to my officers. The ache in my chest had returned during the night, a persistent companion since that bitter winter after Fredericksburg. The doctors called it pericarditis, an inflammation of the heart's lining, but I could not help but see it as something more. Perhaps it was fitting in a way that my own heart should bear its wounds, just as the Army of Northern Virginia and the South itself suffered under the weight of this war. It seemed a grim reflection of all we had endured and all we had yet to endure. "General Lee, sir? Are you awake?" It was Walter Taylor, my ever-efficient aide-de-camp. "Yes, Colonel. Enter." Taylor appeared with a steaming mug of chicory coffee, a luxury these days as the federal blockade had made real coffee nearly impossible to obtain. "The latest dispatches, sir," he said, handing me a leather pouch along with the coffee. "And General Longstreet requests a meeting at your earliest convenience." I nodded, taking a sip of the bitter brew. "Tell him I'll see him after morning prayers." As Taylor departed, I unfolded the map of Pennsylvania on my field desk. The invasion of the North, my invasion, was well underway. Our army had crossed the Potomac days earlier, and now we were pushing through the fertile Cumberland Valley, the breadbasket of Pennsylvania. The farms here were untouched by war, unlike our ravaged Virginia. My men, many shoeless and all of them hungry, moved through a land of plenty. The decision to invade had not been made lightly. After our victory at Chancellorsville in May, despite the grievous loss of Stonewall Jackson, the opportunity seemed clear. The Army of the Potomac was demoralized, its leadership in disarray after yet another change of command. Now General Hooker led them, a man I had taken the measure of and found wanting. President Davis had reluctantly approved my plan, though he worried about leaving Richmond vulnerable. But I knew the surest way to defend Richmond was to threaten Washington. And beyond the military objectives, we desperately needed a victory on northern soil to convince Britain and France to recognize the Confederacy. After 2 years of bloody war, diplomatic recognition might be our only path to independence. I traced the route northward on the map with my finger. Harrisburg, the Pennsylvania capital, lay within our grasp. Beyond that, perhaps even Philadelphia, and somewhere out there, it was prudent to assume the Army of the Potomac was moving to intercept us. "They will come to us," I murmured to myself. "And when they do, we shall defeat them decisively." That was the plan, to select favorable ground, force Hooker to attack us at disadvantage, and destroy his army. Then, with the road to Washington open, the Lincoln government would have no choice but to negotiate peace. After finishing my ablutions and dressing in my gray uniform, deliberately plain, with only 3 stars on each collar to denote my rank, I knelt briefly in prayer. I asked not for victory, but for wisdom and strength to bear the terrible burden of command, knowing that every order I gave would send more young men to their deaths. Outside, the camp was stirring to life. Smoke from thousands of breakfast fires rose into the morning sky. The sound of an army awakening, men's voices, horses whinnying, the clatter of equipment, was as familiar to me as my own heartbeat after all these years of soldiering. Longstreet waited outside my tent, smoking a cigar. My old warhorse, as I sometimes called him, was a solidly built man with a full beard that did little to hide his often dour expression. Since Jackson's death, he had become my principal lieutenant, a steady and methodical commander who valued preparation above all else. "Good morning, General," I greeted him. "General Lee." He nodded respectfully. "I've received some important intelligence overnight." I gestured for him to continue. "First," Longstreet began, "some of our men captured a Union newspaper yesterday. It reports that General Hooker has been relieved of command." This caught my attention. "Replaced? By whom?" "General Meade, sir. George Meade." I searched my memory. Meade had commanded a corps at Fredericksburg, had he not? A competent officer, steady but not particularly aggressive. This change in federal command might work to our advantage. "Interesting," I said thoughtfully. A new commander, unfamiliar with his army, thrust into a campaign already underway. Providence may yet favor us. Longstreet's expression remained grave. "Perhaps, sir, but there is more. You are familiar with my spy, Harrison. He has returned with intelligence suggesting the Union Army is closer than we anticipated and advancing rapidly northward from Frederick. I frowned at this revelation. Without Stuart's cavalry to screen our position and provide timely intelligence, we were increasingly vulnerable. How reliable is this, Harrison? Longstreet nodded firmly. He has always brought true information in the past, sir. He claims their advance elements are already moving toward Pennsylvania and shadowing us closely. I turned to the map on my table, tracing the routes converging on the small crossroads town of Gettysburg. The town's location made it a natural focal point for movement in this region. If they strike while we are dispersed, we could be in grave danger, I said quietly. We must consolidate the army. Longstreet nodded in agreement. Gettysburg offers good roads for concentration and movement, sir. If we move quickly, we can bring the corps together before they catch us divided. Very well, I said decisively. Send orders for General Ewell, General Hill, and your own corps to converge at Gettysburg immediately. We will concentrate there and prepare to meet the enemy. As Longstreet departed to carry out my orders, I considered the peculiar figure who had delivered this vital intelligence. Harrison was an elusive man, a former soldier-turned-spy who operated behind enemy lines with remarkable skill. Though I had never met him personally, his information had proven invaluable on more than one occasion. I gazed northward toward the distant horizon where destiny awaited us. The war had already exacted its toll on my family and my army, but now it seemed poised to demand even more. Let it be swift, I murmured to myself. Let it be decisive. But deep down, I knew that war rarely granted such favors. The morning of July 1st dawned hot and humid. I had established my headquarters at Cashtown, a small crossroads village nestled in the eastern foothills of South Mountain. We had been in Pennsylvania for over a week, and still I lacked precise information about the Federal Army's location. Stuart's cavalry, which should have been providing that intelligence, was absent, riding somewhere to the east on a raid that, while perhaps gallant, left me effectively blind. I was dictating correspondence to Colonel Marshall, my military secretary, when the sound of artillery fire echoed from the direction of the town of Gettysburg, some 8 miles to the east. What do you make of that, Colonel? I asked, pausing mid-sentence. Marshall cocked his head, listening to the distant rumble. Sounds like more than a skirmish, sir. I nodded in agreement. Find Colonel Taylor. I want to know which of our units are in that direction. Within minutes, Taylor returned with the information that General Heth's division of A.P. Hill's corps had marched toward Gettysburg that morning. Heth's objective, as relayed by Brigadier General Pettigrew the previous day, was to investigate reports of supplies in the town and to determine whether Union forces observed there were merely local militia or a more significant presence. Hill himself had authorized the movement, considering it a reconnaissance in force rather than a major engagement. I frowned at this news. My orders had been explicit: avoid a general engagement until the army was concentrated. Yet here was the sound of what appeared to be a significant clash. Send to General Hill. I want to know precisely what is happening. My voice was calm, but inside I felt a stirring of unease. It is possible a battle had chosen us, it seemed, rather than the reverse. As reports began to filter in, the picture became clearer. Heth's division had encountered Federal cavalry west of Gettysburg, and the fight had escalated. Soon after, Federal infantry began arriving on the field. Hill had committed more of his corps to support Heth. By midday, I was on Traveler, riding toward the sound of battle with Longstreet at my side. As we crested a ridge, the panorama of combat spread before us. To the east lay the small town of Gettysburg, a hub from which roads radiated like spokes on a wheel. North of the town, Ewell's corps, which I had ordered to converge on the area upon hearing of the engagement, was driving Federal forces back through the streets. It appears we have the advantage, Longstreet observed, surveying the field through his field glasses. For the moment, I replied. But this is not the ground I would have chosen. Indeed, even as the Federal troops retreated through Gettysburg, I could see them rallying on a hill south of town. Cemetery Hill, they called it, an apt name given what was transpiring. From that elevated position, they would be difficult to dislodge. I turned to General Hill, who had joined us. What is your assessment of the enemy's strength? At least 2 corps and some cavalry, sir. Reynolds' men, I believe, and Howard's. More are arriving. Hill's face was flushed with excitement. He'd been ill recently, but seemed invigorated by the sound of battle. I studied the terrain carefully. To attack the Federal position forming on Cemetery Hill would require a frontal assault up open slopes, costly, perhaps prohibitively so. Yet to withdraw after gaining an initial advantage seemed equally unpalatable. We must strike them before they are fully established, I said finally. General Ewell is to take that hill if practicable. An aide galloped off to deliver the order, bearing my characteristically discretionary instruction to Ewell. In retrospect, perhaps I should have been more direct, more insistent, but I had never believed in commanding my corps leaders as if they were chess pieces, preferring to trust their judgment on the field. As the day waned, I watched with mounting frustration as the Federal line on Cemetery Hill solidified. Ewell, normally aggressive, had become uncharacteristically hesitant after his mentor Stonewall Jackson's death. He reported that the hill appeared too strongly held for an assault without reinforcement. Longstreet, ever the pragmatist, spoke what I was already considering. "Sir, now that we've engaged, we might consider moving around their flank, placing ourselves between them and Washington. Force them to attack us." It was sound military logic, the same maneuver that had served us well in the past. But something held me back, an awareness that the Army of Northern Virginia had never been stronger. These were tried and tested veterans, men who had faced long odds before and emerged victorious. They were battle-hardened, disciplined, and united by a shared confidence born of countless successes. I was convinced that my gray veterans, fighting together as one, could overcome any obstacle and deliver the decisive blow that would end this war. "No," I said finally. "They're here, we are here. If we move, we present our rear to the enemy during the march." I pointed to the ridge where the Federal forces continued to mass. "We will attack them tomorrow." Longstreet's face registered dissent, though he spoke no further. He believed in the defensive battle, in making the enemy come to us. But circumstances had delivered us to this field not of our choosing, and I felt compelled to finish what had begun. As darkness fell, I summoned my corps commanders to a council of war in a small house we had appropriated for headquarters. Ewell, Hill, and Longstreet gathered around a map spread on a simple wooden table, illuminated by flickering candles. "Gentlemen, tomorrow we shall attack," I declared. "General Longstreet, your corps will strike the enemy's left flank, on that ridge." I indicated the southern end of the Federal line. "General Ewell, you will demonstrate against their right to prevent them from reinforcing against Longstreet's attack. General Hill, your corps will hold the center and be prepared to exploit any advantage." As the generals departed to prepare their commands, I stepped outside into the warm summer night. Stars glittered above, the same stars that shone over Arlington, over Richmond, over Washington. The same stars that had witnessed countless battles in this fratricidal conflict. I thought of Chancellorsville, where we had achieved our greatest victory despite being outnumbered more than 2-1. I thought of Jackson, whose brilliant flank march had made that victory possible. If only he were here now. But such thoughts were indulgences I could not afford. I had made my decision. Tomorrow would bring victory or defeat, and with it perhaps the fate of our new nation. In my tent that night, I knelt to pray, asking not for victory, but for strength to bear whatever burden God saw fit to place upon my shoulders. Then I lay down on my camp bed, but sleep proved elusive. The pain in my chest had returned, a reminder of my own mortality. In the darkness, I whispered words my father had taught me long ago. Duty is the sublimest word in the English language. It had guided my life, led me to choose Virginia over the Union I had served for 32 years, and now duty demanded that I send thousands of men into battle once more. Dawn would come soon enough. July 2nd unfolded with maddening delays. Longstreet's corps, which was to deliver the main blow against the Federal left, was slow in getting into position. I had wanted the attack to begin in the morning, but the sun climbed high in the sky as we waited. Every hour allowed the enemy to strengthen their position on the ridges south of Gettysburg. I rode along our lines, taking in the battlefield under the full light of day. The Federal position was even stronger than it had been the evening before. A fishhook-shaped line that stretched from Culp's Hill in the north, curved along Cemetery Hill, and extended southward along Cemetery Ridge to two distinct prominences. The larger of the two was densely covered with trees, while the smaller, just to its north, had a western slope cleared of foliage and littered with boulders. It was a commanding position, naturally suited for defense and daunting for any attacker. Nevertheless, I believed my veterans could carry it. The men cheered as I passed on Traveler, calling out, "Lee to the rear!" Their devotion humbled me. I had never sought their adoration, only their best efforts, but they had given me both. I would not fail them now. The sun climbed higher, and I felt the weight of each passing moment. The attack should have begun by now. Frustration gnawed at me as I turned to one of my aides. "Find General Longstreet," I instructed, my voice sharper than intended. "Ask him why there is a delay." The aide returned after what felt like an eternity, his expression a mix of unease and apology. He reported that Longstreet was waiting for Law's brigade, which had been delayed in reaching the field. To make matters worse, Longstreet had chosen a longer route for his troops to avoid detection by Union scouts, slowing their progress further. My mind raced as I processed this. Time was slipping through our fingers, and with it, the advantage we so desperately needed. By mid-afternoon, Longstreet's attack was finally launched against the Federal left. From my position, I could see his brigades advancing across open fields toward the enemy line. They moved with precision, these veterans of so many battles, maintaining their alignment despite Federal artillery fire. Initial reports were promising. Longstreet's men had found a portion of the Federal line still being formed and drove them back. But then came word that the enemy had reinforced their position. The fighting in the areas later called the wheat field, the peach orchard, and Devil's Den became desperate hand-to-hand struggles for every yard of ground. As evening approached, I received conflicting reports. Some units had broken through, others had been repulsed. Ewell's demonstration against Culp's Hill had turned into a full-scale attack, again with mixed results. I summoned Colonel Marshall. "Ride to General Longstreet. I want his assessment." When Marshall returned, his expression was grave. "General Longstreet reports that while his men have gained ground, they have not broken the enemy line. He has suffered heavy casualties. But he says, sir, never has a corps fought more bravely." I nodded, absorbing the weight of those words. The cost had been high, but the field was not yet lost. Despite the day's difficulties, I sensed opportunity. "Colonel, inform the corps commanders that we will renew the attack tomorrow. The main effort will be against the Federal center." That night, I again conferred with Longstreet. His opposition to another attack was evident, though respectfully expressed. "General Lee, my corps has been bloodied heavily today. Pickett's division is fresh, but it alone cannot break their center." "General Pickett will have support," I assured him. "General Hill's corps will provide divisions and our artillery will prepare the way." I outlined my plan, a massive bombardment followed by a charge against the Federal center, where I had observed their line to be thinnest. When the council ended, Longstreet lingered. "Sir, I must state one more time that I believe this attack will fail." I regarded him steadily. "General, the enemy is there, and there I will strike him." Longstreet saluted and departed, his disagreement plain in the set of his shoulders. I respected his candor. A commander needs officers who speak truth as they see it, but in this, the final decision was mine alone. Dawn of July 3rd revealed a clear sky promising another scorching day. I arose early, the pain in my chest a dull companion, and went to observe the preparations for the attack. Our artillery was being massed, some 150 guns that would open the way for the infantry assault. General Alexander, Longstreet's artillery chief, expressed concern about our ammunition supply. "Sir, we have perhaps enough for an hour's bombardment, no more." "Make every shot count, General," I instructed him. "We must suppress their batteries before our infantry advances." By midday, all was in readiness. I watched from Seminary Ridge as our guns opened fire in the largest artillery barrage yet seen on the American continent. The Federal guns replied, and for over an hour, the air was filled with the thunder of cannon and the screaming of shells. The smoke became so thick that observation was nearly impossible. For a fleeting moment, doubt crept into my mind. Longstreet's warnings echoed in my thoughts, his insistence that this ground was too strong, that this attack would bleed us dry for no gain. What if he was right? What if I was about to send thousands of brave men to their deaths for nothing? This was the moment. If I were to change my mind, it had to be now. But then I thought of all we had sacrificed to bring us to this point, of the cause we fought for, and of what victory here could mean. If we succeeded, it would shatter the Union Army, open the road to Washington, and perhaps bring an end to this terrible war. My chest tightened as I resolved to see it through. There could be no turning back now, not after coming so far. When our guns fell silent, partially from ammunition exhaustion, according to Alexander's report, the Federal artillery also reduced its fire. Was their ammunition also depleted, or were they simply waiting for what they knew would come next? Through the smoke, I could see our infantry forming for the attack. Pickett's fresh division in the center, flanked by Pettigrew's and Trimble's divisions from Hill's corps. Nearly 12,000 men in a line almost a mile wide, tasked with crossing nearly a mile of open ground under enemy fire. As they began their advance, moving with parade ground precision from the shelter of the woods into the open fields, I felt a surge of pride. No finer soldiers had ever existed than these men of Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and other southern states. Their valor deserved victory. What a moving sight it was. I watched through field glasses as Federal artillery opened upon them. Solid shot plowed furrows through their ranks, but they closed up and continued forward. When they came within range of infantry fire, the blue line on Cemetery Ridge erupted in flame. The fencing along the Emmitsburg Road delayed our men, and we paid a heavy price. The carnage was terrible to witness. Entire ranks disappeared in the storm of lead, yet still they advanced, their battle flags held high. For a brief exultant moment, I saw a portion of our line reach the stone wall that marked the Federal position. "They're breaking!" someone near me shouted. But then came the counterattack, Federal reserves moving swiftly to seal the breach. I gripped the reins of my horse tightly, my heart sinking as I realized there were no fresh troops to press the advantage. My army was spent. Every available man had already been committed to the assault. For a fleeting moment, I wondered if I had asked too much of them, if this gamble had been doomed from the start. The breakthrough faltered, and with it, so too did our hopes of victory. Our men began streaming back across the fields they had crossed so bravely. The repulse was complete. Of the nearly 12,000 who had started the charge, barely half returned. I rode forward to meet them, overcome with emotion at their sacrifice. "It's all my fault," I told them as they passed. "It is I who have lost this fight, and you must help me out of it the best way you can." Some reached out to touch my sleeve, to pat Traveler's neck. "We'll fight for you forever, General Lee," one Bloodstreet veteran called out. Their devotion in defeat was almost more than I could bear. Longstreet found me there, his face a mask of grief. He had opposed the attack, had predicted its failure, yet had loyally carried out my orders. "General," he said quietly, "the enemy will surely counterattack now." I hesitated, weighing Longstreet's words. "They have been hurt as badly as we have," I finally said, though it was more hope than certainty that guided my response. In truth, I feared Meade might seize the moment to counterattack and destroy my battered army. That he did not act remains, in my mind, one of his greatest errors of the battle. As night descended upon the blood-soaked fields of Gettysburg, rain began to fall, mingling with the dust and blood of the fallen. It was as if the heavens themselves mourned the fate of my men. The charge had failed. The army was battered, low on ammunition, and short of supplies. There was no question of holding this ground, nor could I risk a withdrawal northward with the enemy at our heels. The only course left was to retreat, to cross the mountains, ford the Potomac, and return to Virginia. This was my first great defeat, a bitter reckoning, but I would not allow it to become a ruinous one. We had lost this battle, but I would not lose this army. In my tent, alone with my thoughts, I penned my report to President Davis. "Too strong a position and too heavy losses," I wrote by candlelight. "More than 1/3 of my magnificent army lay dead, wounded, or captured on this Pennsylvania soil. I thought of my son, of Arlington, of Virginia. I thought of all those who had fallen under my command, and I prayed, not for victory now, but for the strength to lead these men home." The rain continued through the night and into the morning of July 4th, Independence Day for a nation from which we had severed ourselves. The weather matched my mood, gray, heavy, sorrowful. I had failed these men who trusted me, failed the cause for which we fought. The weight of it pressed upon my chest more painfully than my physical ailment. I called a council of my generals early that morning. Ewell, Hill, and Longstreet assembled, their faces drawn with fatigue and the knowledge of defeat. "Gentlemen," I began, "we shall begin our withdrawal today. General Ewell, your corps will lead, followed by General Hill's. General Longstreet, your corps will serve as rear guard." No one spoke against the decision. Even Longstreet, who had counseled a strategic withdrawal before the battle, took no satisfaction in being proved right. "Our wagon train of wounded will proceed by the Chambersburg Road," I continued. "It stretches for 17 miles. Their protection must be our priority. The logistics of moving a defeated army of over 70,000 men through hostile territory and back across the Potomac would challenge the finest quartermasters." When Stuart entered my tent, his normally jaunty demeanor was subdued. The ostrich plume in his hat seemed to droop, like the spirit of our army. "General Lee," he said, saluting, "I understand my absence caused difficulties. It did. I saw no need to elaborate. The simple acknowledgement of his failure would sting more than any rebuke. I offer no excuses, sir. Only my deepest regrets. The past cannot be undone, General Stuart. Your duty now is to screen our retreat. The safety of this army depends on knowing Meade's movements." As he turned to leave, I added, "We have all made errors in this campaign. Mine have been the most grievous." By midday, our melancholy procession had begun moving southwest toward Fairfield. The rain turned roads into quagmires. I rode along the column, acknowledging the salutes of the men. Despite our defeat, their discipline held. On July 7th, I received disheartening news. Heavy rains had swollen the Potomac, making the fords impassable. We were trapped on the northern bank with Meade's army drawing nearer each day. We established a defensive line covering Williamsport, with our backs to the river, a dangerous position, but we had no choice. "We have fought defensively before," Longstreet said, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. Meade's army appeared on July 12th. I expected an attack that might well destroy the Army of Northern Virginia, but Meade, perhaps remembering Fredericksburg, did not immediately strike. In that time, Providence intervened. The river began to fall. On the night of July 13th, I ordered the crossing to begin. Dawn was breaking as I finally turned Traveler toward the Virginia shore. Our great offensive into the north had failed. The high water mark of the Confederacy, some would later call it. On the Virginia bank, I paused to watch the rear guard crossing. Many of the men noticed me waiting and raised a cheer despite their exhaustion. "We'll whip 'em next time, General Lee," one called out. Their faith in me remained unshaken despite the defeat I had led them to. That evening, I composed a letter to President Davis. "Mr. President, it is with deep regret that I must report the failure of our campaign in Pennsylvania. The responsibility rests entirely with me. I therefore respectfully request that you find a younger, more capable officer to command this army." Later, as I knelt to pray, I asked for wisdom, that I might not lead more young men to needless deaths. The pain in my chest eased somewhat as I rose. As I drifted toward sleep, my thoughts turned not to defeat, but to defense. If we could not win through invasion, perhaps we could still win through endurance. Make the cost so high that the North would tire of paying it. My last conscious thought was a simple prayer: "Thy will be done." Whatever God intended for the Confederacy, for the Army of Northern Virginia, and for Robert E. Lee would come to pass. My duty was merely to face each day with courage and bear whatever burden was placed upon my shoulders. Sleep claimed me then, a brief respite from the weight of command that I would take up again with the dawn.